And he's really written more books on science and faith than I think most other people in the world. In fact, he writes more, I think, in a single year than most of us do in a lifetime. And so I'm sure many of us here have appreciated his books, not only on science and religion, but also on theology and so on. And in fact, he has another book coming out, I think, in a couple of weeks' time, Blackwell, The Open Secret, A New Vision for Natural Theology. I actually printed off the chapter title, so if you want to have a look at that, that's imminently about to emerge. Is it published, Alister, or about to come out? About to come out, so look out for that one. The Open Secret, A New Vision for Natural Theology. So we're delighted that Alister's taken time out of a very busy schedule to come and speak to us on the subject biology, the anthropic principle, and natural theology. So thanks, Alister.
Thank you, Dennis. What I want to do in this seminar is to introduce some ideas relating to natural theology and the anthropic principle, particularly as applying to biology, because it seems to me there's some intriguing issues here that we really need to begin to explore. What I want to begin by doing is setting the context and asking, what does natural theology mean? Because some of you will, of course, have read William Paley's well-known book of 1802, and so it may raise some very significant questions for you. And of course, traditionally, natural theology is seen as a sense-making activity in which we try to look at nature and either infer or deduce from that there is a God who is a wise God and so on. And of course, this goes back to the classical period when we find this, what's sometimes called this tripartite vision of natural theology emerging. Natural theology, story-like theology, and civil theology. And these refer to, respectively, a theology based on human reason, a theology based on the great classical myths, and a kind of civil religion which was there to keep society together. And of course, as you remember, the Latin word religio comes from the basic meaning of something that binds people together. So these were very, very significant in the ancient world, and in many ways, Christian theologians have taken over this idea and simply baptized it without necessarily fully transforming it. And certainly we've seen, I think, some changes taking place in recent years. And I think there are two significant developments that take place in the early modern period. One of them is in the writings of people like John Ray and William Derham, two names that I think many of you will know well. And these writers, basically having read Francis Bacon and noted his emphasis on induction, basically saying, look, natural theology cannot simply be about reasoning our way to God. It is about recognizing that in some way nature can be interpreted to point us towards God. So there is this emphasis on beginning to engage with nature, and of course there is a very significant link between the approaches we find in Ray and Derham and that we find in Paley. In fact, Paley very often simply recycles ideas he finds in these earlier writers. But the main point I want to make is that during the Enlightenment, the period that probably began about 1750 and continued to be influential up until the Second World War, natural theology came to be understood as a means of establishing God's existence without reference to existing religious beliefs. In other words, it was a way of demonstrating the existence of God without an appeal to the Bible, without an appeal to any form of religious tradition. It was seen as a way of establishing religious truth without any religious preconceptions. And if I have time, I talk about the historical factors that led to that development. But I want you to notice this represents an attenuation, a narrowing down of what natural theology actually might be thought to be. And in our own day and age, we're seeing some new trends emerge. These actually point in quite opposite directions. Most Christian theologians have given up on natural theology as something that has no future at all. And again, I mentioned the name of Karl Barth, a very well-known Swiss Protestant theologian, who took the view that natural theology had no place. If God reveals himself, then why do we need to go trying to find God in nature? And so Barth mounted quite a significant critique of natural theology, basically saying it had no role in a properly understood Christian way of thinking. But on the other hand, quite recently, we've seen more within the scientific community the raising of questions which clearly have theological implications. And again, it would be wrong, I think, to single out any one book as either causing or particularly well representing this trend. But certainly you might think of Tipler and Barrow's book on the cosmic anthropic principle as a book in this category, as raising questions that emerge from the natural sciences with deeper implications. And therefore you can see that there is a kind of momentum for the rediscovery of natural theology coming not so much from the theological community, but rather from the natural scientific community. And clearly there's a need for a discussion here. There's a classic definition of natural theology from the American philosopher of religion, William Alston. Again, you'll probably recognize the basic ideas. Natural theology is, I quote, the enterprise of providing support for religious beliefs by starting from premises that neither are nor presuppose religious beliefs. So that's the way natural theology has been understood. I want to argue for a revisionary approach, for rethinking what natural theology is. And what I want to suggest to you is that natural theology, which is open to multiple interpretations, should not be thought really of as an attempt to look at nature and then deduce or necessarily infer that there is a God from doing that, but rather to ask what way of looking at the natural world is made possible by inhabiting the Christian faith. In other words, you're working on the assumption that the Christian faith changes the way you think, changes the way you see things. For example, you might think Paul in Romans 12 talking about the renewal of your minds. The clear assumption is that in some way the Christian faith changes the way in which you see things. And so the argument I want to develop is that natural theology is the way of seeing the natural world which is made possible by the Christian faith. In other words, there is no question of trying to prove God's existence. Rather, what you're saying is that the way in which Christians see the world resonates with what is actually there. It's about resonance or consonance, not proof. And that seems to me to be a much more modest and realistic approach to natural theology. In effect, you're not saying you prove God's existence, but you are saying that the way in which the Christian sees nature does resonate with what is actually observed. So there's an indirect confirmation, if you like, of what the Christian is saying. And again, I want to make the point that if you read William Paley, for example, Paley tends to present nature as a very interesting puzzle. And the question is, what's the best way of making sense of this? And I want to affirm that indeed, the question of how we make sense of nature is a very valid question. But I think I want to say you don't stop there, that there is actually more to natural theology than simply trying to make sense of things. And therefore I want to argue that the traditional Platonic triad, a phrase I'm sure you've come across before, which talks about truth, beauty, and goodness, offers a very appropriate framework for exploring the Christian engagement with the natural order. Now again, if you read someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, his book Unweaving the Rainbow, one of the points he makes in that book is his view that if you believe in God, there is an aesthetic attenuation of your engagement with nature. In other words, your belief in God in some way impoverishes your appreciation of the beauty of nature. I think he's quite wrong. But nevertheless, I must note he made that criticism, and therefore it is, I think, important to ask, in what way can we begin to appreciate properly the beauty of nature that really is there? But in this lecture, I'm simply going to be talking about natural theology as sense-making. I'm going to limit it to that very specific approach, and I'm going to just explain to you how I've developed this. I began setting these out in some lectures I gave at Newcastle earlier this year. I'll be giving the Gifford lectures next year and focusing especially on the linkage between natural theology and anthropic phenomena. And then late next year, maybe early 2010, I'll be back here in Cambridge to give the Hullsian lectures, and there I'm going to be focusing on natural theology and Darwinism. because it seems to me that Darwin's bicentenary actually gives us a very opportune moment to begin to reappraise what, not simply Darwin's impact, but the impact of Darwinism in general might be on natural theology. And I think there's a lot of revisionary thinking going on within Darwinism, which may let us move in some very interesting directions there. There's a book that Dennis mentioned, the book called The Open Secret. It's an interesting picture. For those of you who don't know it, it's by Stanley Spence. It's unusual. And the title of this picture is Consider the Lilies. And it's very interesting. I have to say, these lilies look more like daisies to me. This may be my lack of aesthetic appreciation. I'm wondering if Spence's kind of way echoing Chaucer, who said you should get down on your knees to look at a daisy. And that theme seems to be built into that. But anyway, it's about the close attention to nature, believing that this is worthwhile and significant. I want to put a quote here on the screen from James Barr. This is from James Barr's very interesting book of 1993, Biblical Faith and Natural Theology. I'm going to read it to you. Now I want to focus on one point and just linger there for a few moments. Traditionally, Barr writes, natural theology has commonly meant something like this: that by nature, that is, just by being human beings, men and women have a certain degree of knowledge of God and awareness of Him, or at least a capacity for such awareness, and that this knowledge or awareness exists anterior to the special revelation of God made through Jesus Christ, through the Church, through the Bible. And again, that's a very useful working definition of what natural theology might be. But what I want to focus on is that actually, in making that statement, Barr is opening up a question which I don't think has been sufficiently explored in the literature to date. And that is the link between natural theology and the psychology of perception. Because clearly Barr here is asking, in what way do we naturally look at nature? How do we perceive it? What processes affect the way in which we perceive it as this rather than as that? And so that seems to me to be a very important theme to explore. And in the book, The Open Secret, my wife, who's a psychologist, has contributed a chapter on the psychology of perception and natural theology. I think that's a very significant area to explore. But the main topic today is natural theology in relation to anthropic phenomena, and especially in relation to biology. And what I want to do, therefore, is just very briefly introduce this idea for the benefit of anybody who this is strange, and then try and flag up some of the interesting questions that are beginning to emerge. And again, it's a recent term. Brandon Carter really popularized it back in 1974. And in a paper he published then, he tried to get across this idea that in some way, looking at the fundamental constants of the universe, there was this impression of, well, he uses the word design. And of course, it's a very interesting position. I don't think it was necessarily a very good choice of words, because clearly anthropic comes from anthropos, a human being, and what Carter, I think, meant to imply is not so much that it led to human beings as it led to life, and therefore perhaps the idea of a biocentric approach might be better, but anyway, the term has stuck, and it's very, very difficult to undo history, so we're going to use the word anthropic while noting that it's not necessarily the best word to use. And of course, many of you will come across Lawrence Henderson, Harvard professor, very, very able chemist, but also aware of the implications of his work, for example, in relation to the blood. And in his book, The Fitness of the Environment, published in 1913, he simply made the observation that it seemed to him that in some way the environment was constrained in such a way that it led to the emergence of life. And again, the quote that most people know from this book, the whole evolutionary process, both cosmic and organic, is one, and a biologist may now rightly regard the universe in its very essence as biocentric. And interestingly, really Henderson is focusing on a number of things. One of them is the very unusual physical chemistry of water, and also the organic chemistry of carbon. And both of those are things that I think we'll be coming back to shortly, because they are clearly very significant. So what sort of anthropic phenomena are we talking about? Well, clearly, most speculation to date has had to do with the constants of the universe. And I'll be coming back to that presently. This perception that some of these fundamental constants are fine-tuned for life. Or to put it another way, if their values were slightly different from those that we know to be the case, then the universe would be different. So different that, in fact, we wouldn't be here to observe it. Now, again, there are interesting observations to be made about this. For example, is this actually significant? Well, certainly it's worth looking at. But certainly, really, this is where most speculation has been directed. And again, if you look at the large literature of anthropic phenomena, it tends to focus on this issue. And that is entirely understandable. And in fact, in this lecture, I'm going to be making the point that although we can amplify this, actually the amplifications keep bringing us back to this initial point. But there are other issues. For example, the origins of life. What conditions had to prevail for the origins of life? Now, clearly, you might talk about a large number of issues here, but as someone whose undergraduate love was chemistry, I mean, the chemistry of life actually is quite astonishing. I'll come back to that in a moment. Or again, a point Henderson made, but again has been discussed in much more detail later. Water itself is quite remarkable. Those of you who are chemists, you think of H2O, you think of the rest of the series, H2S, H2SE. They are gases. Why isn't water gaseous under normal conditions? Well, the answer is, of course, because of the rather unusual degree of hydrogen bonding. And again, recent studies have suggested that, again, the extent of hydrogen bonding in water is really quite significant. A little bit less, a little bit more, things would be very, very different indeed. Again, a point that's been made recently, again, is how absolutely fundamental chemistry is for evolution. For evolution to take place, there have to be certain elements in place. If they are not there, then this isn't going to happen. And again, I'll come back to this point in looking at the chemistry of carbon, because it's very, very significant. If you read someone like Steve Benner from the University of Florida, who clearly is alarmed at anthropic speculation, he will say, well, of course, if you look at the curious chemistry of water, well, I mean, in some ways, liquid ammonia has similar properties, so does liquid methane. But actually, when you start looking at this argument in more detail, there may be replication of one or more aspects of the behavior of water. But water is not an aggregate of individual aspects. It is a total system. And no other solvent, really, has anything remotely approaching the properties of water. Or again, Benner makes the point that, well, silicon forms chains just like carbon. But again, they are not very long chains, and they're not very stable chains. When you work out the length of carbon chains in DNA and so on, and calculate the amount of coding that can be embedded in these, the amount of encoding that can be embedded in silicon chains is actually about 64 bytes. So it's very questionable how much information these could develop. And again, when we begin to look at the actual mechanisms of evolution, we find very much the same things beginning to emerge. That actually there are chemical issues here, which again make us realize that if, for example, the fundamental properties of carbon were slightly different, then the chains would be unstable, there'd be all kinds of issues arising from the failure to concatenate, and this would have major implications. And again, moving to a slightly different level, and again, this is really looking at Simon Conway Morris and others, who stress that actually the directionality of evolution maybe is rather more interesting than used to be thought. And again, I'll come back to this, but many of you will have read this and be thinking about it. I'm mentioning here Bob Williams. Again, I expect some of you in this room will know of him, and some of you will probably know him as well. There he is. And in a series of works over the last 10 years, Bob has, in effect, been flagging up how the chemical properties of transition metal ions are of critical importance for biological redox reactions. In other words, if they were slightly different, then a whole range of biological processes we take for granted simply wouldn't be happening at all. And again, Bob and I have often talked about this, and Bob, I remember saying to me at one of these things where he says, I'm not a religious man, but there's something bloody odd going on here. And if you had to summarize the anthropic principle, I suppose that actually is quite a good shorthand for trying to get what's involved. So again, just looking at these things, I haven't got time to work my way through this properly today. What I'm going to do, if I may, is just dangle before you some points which can easily be amplified, and then focus on a few issues that emerge from this. But the point I want to emphasize is that fine-tuning is not limited to cosmic constants. It keeps recurring at every level of the whole system. The chemical, the biochemical, the biological. Let's look at the question of the origins of life. Again, think of the key things that really need to be there for life to take place. Bear in mind, most definitions of life include a stipulation that something that is living should be capable of Darwinian evolution. Again, when you start looking at this, there has to be a requirement for metabolism, that's to say, a capacity to be able to extract energy from the environment, for energy conversion, for genetic transmission, for evolvability. And these things have to happen on the basis of what is available. And a point that others have made, and I'm going to make again, is that very often biologists in particular seem to think that biological systems simply come along and they use these chemicals that are there in the environment and it's completely unproblematic, so the result is evolution is very easily explained. It does not have an anthropic dimension. The key point I want to emphasize is that it is not unproblematic that evolution makes use of the chemicals that are there, because they didn't need to be like that at all. And the point I want to stress again is that, for example, if we take here's transition metals, for example, if their energy levels were different, then some of the key processes on which life depends might not be happening at all. There are, I think, significant issues here. Can one talk about fine-tuning in biology? Certainly, you can talk about this in relation to physics. What about biology? Well, clearly, there is an issue here. And, for example, Graham Cairns-Smith talks about this in an article I'm sure some of you will come across. And he makes some very fine points, but really the issue he's trying to flag up is that biology tunes itself. That actually there's a tendency for biological systems to have their own mechanisms for fine-tuning. And that, I think, must be conceded. But again, the point I want to emphasize is this. The fact that biological systems have this capacity to evolve in this fine-tuned manner, responding to the environment, actually is critically dependent on the properties of certain core elements. And were those different, I'm not sure this would be happening at all. And again, if you look at this from 1945, those of you historians will see it's very interesting. There are some interesting gaps in it. There's again T. Seaborg, 1945. But again, if you look at the elements that really play this key role, they're basically straddled along this grouping, a few down here, a few up here. But basically, it's that first row of transition metal elements that Williams argues play such a critical role in the generation and the transmission of life. So, if you think about these things, for example, you can easily see how important hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus are. Very interesting article some years ago, why nature chose phosphates. Intriguing analysis of the rather unusual properties of phosphates, which actually seem to underlie their incorporation into biological systems, plus a range of key metals. Now you can see the way this argument's going to go. But let's just focus, as we may, on carbon again. Carbon's propensity to form long, complex change, to form ring compounds, which can enfold, for example, metal ions, as in hemoglobin or in chlorophyll or vitamin B12, actually is really extremely significant. And it is not mirrored by other elements, including silicon. So the point that we need to make is that anthropic phenomena are traditionally linked with initial conditions of the universe. And again, many of you have read Martin Rees's book, Just 6 Numbers. And he gives examples, that if, for example, the strong coupling constant were very slightly smaller, there would just be hydrogen. If the gravitational fine structure constant was slightly smaller, there'd be no stars or planets. And these, I think, are ideas you're all very familiar with. But here is the point that we need to make at the biological level. In the initial conditions of what we still call the Big Bang, Fred Hoyle's term, originally introduced actually to discredit the idea that the universe had an origin, because Hoyle was slightly nervous. This seemed to be a bit religious. But if you think about the key point, in the initial moments of the Big Bang, the elements that are there are lots of hydrogen, but a third as much helium and a tiny amount of lithium, and maybe, perhaps a little bit of beryllium, a little bit of boron, but basically that's it. And you don't get life from those three. In fact, you don't get very much from helium. And the real point is this, that the formation of stars is necessary for the production of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. In other words, the Big Bang by itself does not explain life. What we need is a Big Bang followed by heterogeneity, which allows the coalescence or the clumping of material in large amounts so that the thermonuclear process of nucleogenesis can begin within stars. And that's the key point. Again, I come back to these fundamental cosmic conditions. If they had been different, then these critical elements for life, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, atomic numbers 6, 7, and 8, simply wouldn't be there. So again, you can see their existence is anthropically constrained. And again, many of you will have read the very interesting article back in 1957, which really got the whole debate about the nucleogenesis of elements inside the stars underway by Burbidge, Fowler, and Hoyle. And of course, for these writers, a key issue began to emerge, and it's to do with these reactions that take place. The fusion of helium nuclei initially to give beryllium, which could easily become a beryllium bottleneck, but then it continues to carbon, and then to give oxygen. And you probably all are familiar with Hoyle's fundamental reflection that this is an extremely improbable process, because it requires 3 helium nuclei to come together for a very brief period of time. And Hoyle's point was, unless there was something about the stability of these two, this wasn't going to happen. There had to be some kind of resonance between carbon-12 and oxygen-16 to allow this process of helium nucleus capture to take place. And this is from Hoyle's later recollections about this, where again, first of all, we'll look at the science, then his interpretation. From 1953 onwards, Willie Fowler and I have been intrigued by the remarkable relation of the 7.65 million electron-volt energy level in the nucleus of carbon-12 to the 7.12 million electron-volt level in oxygen-16. If you wanted to produce carbon and oxygen in roughly equal quantities by stellar nucleosynthesis, these are the levels you'd have to fix. And the fixing would have to be just where these levels are actually found to be. And Hoyle found that, an overwhelming thought. He continues, another put-off job, following the above argument, I'm inclined to think so. And again, basically he moves on to say there are therefore no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Again, must be careful not to exaggerate what he's saying, but certainly he's saying this resonance actually is of fundamental importance. It didn't have to be like this, it is like this, and because it is like this, we have carbon and oxygen, and that really is the basis of this universe which generates life. And again, many of you will know that paper. If not, I put on the screen. Then we come to the evolutionary process itself. And again, many of you here in Cambridge will know all about what Simon Conway Morris has been up to recently. But basically, what he is arguing is that evolution is not quite the random development that many have supposed it to be. And he uses this analogy that Stephen Jay Gould developed, a very 1990s analogy, replaying the videotape. I mean, videotapes are on their way out, really. But his argument is actually that evolution is much more directed than you might think. And certainly what he's arguing, again, look at his final sentence, is recognizing that there is a recurrent tendency of biological organization to arrive at the same solution to a particular need. So if you could use the metaphor of biological space, I mean, really what Conway Morris is saying is that in some way life is able to navigate to the hospitable regions in biological space. And those are relatively few, and they are also relatively stable. And he developed this very interesting phrase, islands of stability. And again, if I had time, I talk about chemical space, where there's a very similar issue at stake, but certainly the basic argument is that nature finds its way to the best options. Now, again, you might say, well, that is really what standard Darwinism is saying, but Conway Morris is actually saying it's a much more directed, and while one can't use the word predictable, because that implies you're standing here and asking what comes next, it is certainly explicable, meaning we're standing here, we can see how it got from there to there. So I think Morris has raised some very interesting questions. And again, he puts the word navigate in inverted commas very wisely. Nevertheless, he's emphasizing, I think, that there is a much more directed nature to evolution than many had thought. So again, there's an interesting point there. And Morris gives us this intriguing analogy of discovering Easter Island, which is somewhere there. And his argument is that it's in the middle of nowhere, but the Polynesians had search strategies which meant they found their way to that place, even though it's so isolated. And his argument is that evolution involves search mechanisms which were able to navigate their way to these islands of stability. And what determines the stability of these islands? Well, actually, it's the properties of what they are made. And again, there is an anthropic argument to be made there, even though I haven't time to make that in any detail at all this afternoon. So how do we make sense of this? Well, in recent years, there's been a lot of interest in what Augustine has to say on creation. And in this book, The Literal Meaning of Genesis, 12 books, he basically begins to lay out an approach to interpreting Genesis which he believes is very, very significant. He uses the word literally in a way that might surprise us, for Augustine literally means as the authors intended, which is slightly different from what we might mean by this. I mean, someone looking at that title might just think Augustine's talking about the literal interpretation of Genesis. He's not actually meaning that. He's saying, let us ask what is the intended interpretation of this book. And interestingly, Augustine in many ways laid down the framework of interpretation in the Western Christian tradition of what Genesis was all about. What he said may surprise some of you. It will certainly surprise those of you who are used to more conservative Protestant expositions of this text. Is what Augustine said in 405. Number one, against the prevailing wisdom of his day and age, which favoured the idea that the universe was eternal, Augustine insisted that everything had been brought into being at a specific moment. So, this is very much creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, at a specific moment in time. He then, interestingly, develops a secondary idea that there is an instantaneous moment of creation in which the universe is brought into being, within which are embedded, he uses the Latin phrase, rationis seminalis, seminal reasons, seed-bearing reasons. But the point he's making is that in some way, the act of creation involves God embedding potentialities in the natural order, which will become activated or realized at such time as the moment is right. Now that's an intriguing idea. And you can see how that idea has a lot of mileage to it. He then goes on to insist that this process of development is not arbitrary, it takes place in the context of God's providential direction. And again, he comes back to this point that an image of a dormant seed is an appropriate but not exact analogy for these embedded causalities. Augustine says it's a bit like God making a universe with seeds, and the seeds will germinate and grow at some point in the future. The universe at God's moment of creation is not the same as the universe will be later because it changes. Now again, this is not a static view of the universe at all. It's a developmental view. And then he then says that the process of generation of these dormant seeds results in the fixity of biological forms. And he borrows that idea, A, from his own observation, and B, from the natural science of his day. And so interestingly, the first 4 points are really what he gets from engaging with Genesis and the Bible as a whole. The 5th point really is just doffing his cap towards contemporary scientific wisdom. What would happen if scientific wisdom changed? The first 4 of Augustine's points would remain pretty much the same, but this one might change. So I just want to say to you that Augustine actually has a lot to offer those of you who want to find a way of thinking about evolution in a theistic perspective. This is what he says, just so you can get an idea of the kind of language and imagery he uses. These, in other words, these rationis seminalis, these seminal reasons, were made by God in the beginning, when he simultaneously made the world and all things which were to be unfolded in the ages to come. They possess nothing that was not already present in them causally. They have, however, just begun, since in them are the seeds of the future perfections that would arise from their hidden state, and which will be manifested at the appropriate time. I want to suggest to you that Augustine is offering us a framework for thinking about anthropic phenomena. It can be developed, I think, very easily and very effectively, but again, I'm running out of time, so I won't be doing that in this lecture. I must end by making the obvious point that talking about anthropic phenomena raises questions, and they are reasonable questions to ask. First of all, isn't this just trivial? The fact that I am here to observe that the universe has such qualities that I am here actually does seem to involve a lot of circularity. Now, I think you can raise a challenge to that by saying it may well be a circularity, but it's an extremely improbable circularity, and therefore that itself requires explanation. But certainly that is a significant concern. McMullen, who is coming to teach us here one of the Faraday courses, has made some interesting points about this. Or again, and I think this is perhaps the most significant challenge in our own day and age, Bernard Carr and others have argued that, basing themselves on the early inflation of the universe, that actually there might be many such universes which have developed differently over time, perhaps with fundamental constants which are different. And his argument, therefore, would be that this might well be true for this universe, but it would not be true necessarily for all others. The key question then would be, well, how many others are we talking about? And some of the numbers given are very, very large. But again, this, I would want to suggest, is actually rather hypothetical and speculative, even though it's very interesting. And I'm slightly nervous about investing too much in that approach. And the third approach, Nick Bostrom is a very good example of this, the observation selection effect. Basically, it simply means that the conditions under which we observe things are such that the answer is forced. To give you a simple example, most dinosaurs' skeletons have been found in mud ponds. So you might say, well, maybe this shows that dinosaurs liked mud ponds or something like that. It may just be that mud ponds is where they got trapped and died and were preserved in an acceptable way. It may all be an observer selection effect rather than the real effect. And Boston is saying, look, maybe this is part of the picture as well. But of course, there is this point that is absolutely consistent with the Christian revelation. Augustine had never heard of the Big Bang. Augustine didn't know anything about how the universe came into being, and yet on the basis of his reading of Scripture and his intelligent reflection on it, he comes up with the idea of creation from nothing in an instant, which then evolves over a long period of time into what we see today. There's an awful lot of detail to fill in, but you can see that it's certainly a framework that we can do a lot with. And again, I must stress, this is not about proving God's existence. It is about affirming the resonance or the consistency of what we actually see with what Christians think ought to be the case. There's a quote from John Henry Newman that may surprise some of you. This is a letter Newman wrote in 1870. He said, "I believe in design because I believe in God, not in God because I see design." And again, what he's really saying here is, look, from my standpoint of knowing what God is like and looking at the world, I see that God echoed in the world. And that is a further reason for believing in this God, even though I don't believe in this God by reflecting on nature. So it's, if you like, a kind of circular process of reinforcement. And of course, many of you will know that the issue of inference to the best explanation has come to play a major role in recent philosophy of science. Gilbert Harman, of course, is a very significant figure here, as is Charles Peirce, talked about the idea of abduction. And the basic point that we find in Harman is, and I just mentioned this and say I'm very sorry I was here about Peter Lipton. I think it's a great loss indeed. But basically, that there are many explanations of the world, and we do have to ask which of them offers the best fit, and then realize that actually the question of how we work out which is the best is controversial. Is it the loveliest explanation? Is it the likeliest explanation? But nevertheless, the key point to draw from this is that we are not talking about knockdown arguments. It's much more, here is a complex picture. We recognize there are many possible explanations, but we still believe in principle that we can point to one and say, this is the best. And again, the anthropic debates of recent years, I think, have simply made us realize how fruitful the Christian way of looking at things is. And again, so we might ask these questions. What big picture offers the best account of what we experience? Big picture. In other words, I want to make absolutely clear that we are not talking about the God of the gaps. We're talking about the best explanation. And if I had time, I'd look at some of the things we observe and might want to explain. But I want, if I may, to make a very important point. And that is that natural theology should not be about looking at things and saying, we can't explain that, so we insert God in that explanatory gap. We say rather that it's because we can make sense of things at all that actually we begin to think about God. It's by looking at the big picture, not the gaps, that we begin to move in this direction. And again, if I can mention Charles Coulson here, who I knew during his time at Wadham. I mean, he was a very able exponent of this view in his book Science, Christian Belief, which is still worth reading, in my view. He's talking here about the God of the gaps. It's a fatal step to take, he says, for it's to assert you can plant some sort of hedge in the country of the mind to mark the boundary where a transfer of authority takes place. And there are two problems, he says. Number one, it presupposes a dichotomy of existence. Well, that's an anticipation of Stephen Jay Gould's approach. And here you have Coulson, in effect, saying this is not defensible, even, 30 years before Gould was thinking in these directions. But more importantly, it invites science to discover new things and then gradually take possession of that which religion once held. Either God is in the whole of nature or is not there at all. I want to endorse that. I think Coulson is absolutely right. And therefore, for me, it's the big picture. The explicability of the world requires explanation. And, Einstein wrote some slightly manic things, but that 1936 quote, I think, is laden with significance. The eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. Why can we make sense of what is there and represent it mathematically? Michael Polanyi's very interesting quote, "The pursuit of discovery is guided by sensing the presence of a hidden reality towards which our clues are pointing." I want to suggest anthropic phenomena are clues which certainly point towards something. The question is, what is their best explanation? And my final slide is from someone who both Oxford and Cambridge can claim as their own. And there's a quote from his very famous essay, "Is Theology Poetry? I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." In other words, Christianity makes sense in itself, but it also makes sense of other things as well. And I want to suggest to you today that it gives a framework which I think allows us to interact with and appreciate and make at least some sense of anthropic phenomena. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alister, for that great overview. We've got quite a bit of time now for questions. I think it should be, is there a microphone around? Yeah, there is. So please can you just wait for the microphone to come, and there's a question at the front here. Thank you. So,
you mentioned at the beginning.
so just hold
still
one
technical
second while we
difficulty.
switch that off, and then... Okay, yes, thank you. Yes.
You mentioned at the beginning that you thought the word anthropic would be better replaced by biocentric, because life is the important thing and not humanity. I think it's a potential weakness in the anthropic argument that there's disagreement about what the crucial thing is that the universe is finely tuned for. You say it's life, others have said it's perhaps humanity or consciousness or intelligent life. And this reminded me of a paper I read by Mark Colvian, which was trying to do a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the whole fine-tuning argument. And he said, why shouldn't we say the universe is finely tuned for the game show Wheel of Fortune? Because presumably the constants and the fine-tuning that will be required for Wheel of Fortune to be possible will be even more accurate and incredibly finely tuned than for life. So how would you respond to that kind of...
Well, I think it's a perfectly fair point in that if we're saying it's fine-tuned, you have to then follow that through by saying it is fine-tuned for something. And clearly, what is it fine-tuned for? It might be the observer who collapses the wave function. I mean, it might be biological existence, all kinds of things. And actually, for me, that isn't really the critical point. I mean, I hear there's a real definitional miasma here, which is unsatisfying. But for me, I think the best way of approaching this is to go back to Charles Peirce. Charles Peirce, as you know, who invented the idea of abduction, and actually was a scientist himself, argued that in many ways the impetus for theoretical reflection was what he called surprising facts. In other words, something you saw which didn't seem right, or which if it was right, was surprising. And he then said, look, the fact that it surprises us is an intuition that our contemporary theories don't accommodate this. Therefore, the theories need expansion. And so for me, anthropic phenomena are examples of surprising facts, something that seems to be there. And the question, therefore, is how do we adapt or accommodate or expand our theoretical thinking to make sense of them? So for me, the question, what are they fine-tuned for, actually is subsidiary. It's just this gut feeling we have that this is very odd. And therefore, the kind of explanations that are being proposed, maybe this is just a selection effect, or maybe it's the multiverse things. These are all explanations of the surprise we feel by these. And again, I think it is interesting that when people began to lay out these things, which really began back in the early 70s, they did cause surprise. Even though the people who were very often laying them out actually had a very good grasp of the theory, they just thought there is something here that needs to be explained. it's very difficult to cognitively amplify this. It's much more this intuition. I can't put quite my finger on, but there is something deeper here that we need to follow through. And it's that intuition, there's something important here, let's try and follow it through. And that's really where the significance of these things lies.
Thank you. Yes, question over here, and then one in the back. Thanks.
Thanks. It seems to me that the anthropic principle, the device to justify a theistic worldview, sort of mixing two things. One is the Panglossian paradigm, namely that my nose is shaped this way precisely so it can support spectacles. I mean, would you say that the more rational approach, and I suppose that's a loaded term, rational, the approach is to say that I wear glasses thanks to the shape of my nose, not that the shape of my nose is built so I can wear glasses.
Yes, and again, I see the point you're making. And again, that point from Candide is a very good point. The question is whether it actually helps us with this discussion. I mean, as I approach this, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that anthropic phenomena necessarily point us in a theistic direction. Though interestingly, and the point's very often been made that very often the intellectual energy invested in trying to construct alternative explanations does sometimes seem to almost reflect an anti-religious bias. Again, Hoyle's adoption of the steady state model and his use of the Big Bang as a kind of scare phrase to make people suspicious about the idea of cosmic origins, I think is an illustration of this fact. In fact, there's some various papers I was reading just last week making the point that actually you can't avoid theistic agendas, whether it's pro-theist or anti-theist in this, because they are so obviously opening these things up. For me, basically, I would say that anthropic phenomena prove absolutely nothing. They do raise the most fundamental of questions. But I think really what we're talking about, and again, you may feel I'm wrong here, but this is the way I see it. What I think is anthropic phenomena aren't providing us with answers, but they're providing us with a framework for discussion. By forcing us to say, look, maybe this is just purely natural. That's great, but we have to explain this. Or maybe actually it is open to interpretation along a different axis with a very interesting outcome. The approach I'm adopting is saying, not I believe in God because of anthropic phenomena. I mean, actually, people believed in God long before 1971, shall we say. But it's actually just the realization that the very elementary Christian doctrine of creation I just played around with from Augustine actually contains within itself a framework that helps us make sense of this. So the key question is this philosophical issue. Does the capacity of something to explain have implications for its reality? And I think there is a connection between capacity to explain and reality, but obviously there has to be more to it than that. But therefore what I'm suggesting is not that this proves anything, but actually it does suggest that there may be plausibility in this claim, and therefore something that's well worth taking a bit further. Thank you.
So a question at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering if I could push you a bit on that distinction between capacity to explain and proof. I'm not a scientist myself, but my understanding is that within the realm of scientific discourse, we take as proven, at least provisionally, the thing that best explains the facts, whereas maybe a philosopher might be looking for that knockdown argument that you mentioned doesn't exist. So at what point can we say that the fact that the hypothesis of a designer explains the facts really very nicely indeed, and there are facts that we find it hard to explain without that hypothesis if we think that the universe is all that there is? At what point are we able to say, actually, for scientific purposes, that actually does constitute a proof, albeit not a knockdown proof?
Well, I think, just going back to the first point you made, I mean, I think there are relatively few things we can prove with anything approaching certainty. I mean, I can prove 2 and 2 make 4. I don't think that's going to really advance our discussion very much. I think the much bigger question is, look, for example, we observe these things in the world around us. What's the best explanation? Or what other entities do we need to propose to make sense of what we actually do observe, to give you an example of that? And certainly, I think most philosophers of science would say, at least to begin with, The other theory seems to offer a good explanation of what is known, and preferably it could say, look, we don't know this yet, but there might be a good reason to think that this also might be so we go and try and find it. Well, that would seem, on the whole, to be a suggestion that this theory has real mileage in it. Now, obviously, I mean, history provides us with lots of examples that do conform to that, and some that don't. And in fact, as you probably know, there's a various debate about the logic of discovery and the logic of justification, because very often the logic that leads people to make a discovery doesn't have this rational deductive character. I mean, think of Kekulé and the benzene ring. I mean, that was just a purely intuitive leap, which he made apparently while dozing in front of a fire. But nevertheless, it led to a logic of justification, which made him think, maybe I can actually show this is the case. So I would certainly want to say that the capacity of a theory to explain is an indicator of its potential truth-bearing, but it's not a guarantee of it. And the real issue is, as I was suggesting, that for any one set of observations, there will be several theories that are capable of explaining it. And that's why Pierre Duhem, in a very interesting book published in 1920, simply made the point that in some areas of science it is very, very difficult to talk about conclusive experiment. Precisely because, if you do this experiment, what does it actually prove or disprove? Does it prove the main assumption or simply some subsidiary assumption? It's very, very difficult to interpret that. But I think, nevertheless, for me, it is valid to ask what is the best explanation, and at least to be able to try and articulate what the criteria might be. And certainly elegance, fecundity, stability, comprehensiveness might be part of this. It's not conclusive. And that's why it's very important for me that I'm not saying I believe in God because of anthropic phenomena. Like John Henry Newman, I can make sense of these from my theistic perspective, but they don't generate that perspective in the first place. But having seen this, that kind of way gives me a feedback loop to my theism, which makes me think, actually, maybe this is better than I thought it was. Thank you.
Yes, a lot of hands here. So, Chris, right in front of you. Yes.
Yes, surely, I'm a humanities interloper today as well, but surely from a theological point of view, what you say makes far more sense than, say, those arguments from design that people have been trying to use in the past. Simply because ultimately, of course, conversion is a spiritual act rather than something done on the basis of seeing the anthropic principle. Therefore, you become a Christian through seeing your need for salvation. But what you're doing is actually providing a brilliant apologetic to make people think, well, at least there's something to the Christian faith that makes it worth considering. In other words, what you're doing is putting all these things back into the field of apologetics, which they shouldn't really have left. And therefore, that's why what you're doing, to me, seems to make much more theological sense than the people who are trying to say, believe in God because. Because actually, one of the things, if you look at intelligent design people, they say that all they're doing is saying, you can actually believe in a God. I mean, you can believe in the tooth fairy. I mean, from the arguments that they use, which from a Christian point of view isn't actually any use at all. So what you're doing is bringing us back to where Paul was doing preaching on Mars Hill, and where Paul then went on to say, and actually the real issue is your need of salvation. So you're actually bringing us back to the biblical way of doing things. Would that be a fair theological?
Yes, I think it would. I'm very glad to have that comment. Thank you.
Right.
One more.
Next to Wang Yang. Yes.
You mentioned that you disagree with a kind of natural theology that starts from a neutral standpoint. But don't you think that the method and the criteria of inference to the best explanations itself can provide the kind of neutral standpoint where theists and atheists can argue about the existence of God?
Yes, I agree completely. I mean, I'm not saying that there is no value to having a public disputation on neutral territory about what the best way of making sense of the world is. In fact, I welcome that. I'm just saying that for me isn't really what natural theology is, but it's a very important enterprise. And whatever name we choose to attach to that, it certainly needs to be done. Because, I mean, for example, in the current debates occasioned by Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, I mean, it is actually a very important part of that debate. We observe certain things. What is the best way of making sense of them? Well, Dawkins says, it's a self-assembling replicator that makes most sense of things. I would say something very different. And I think that it is a very important debate to be had. and a very important debate to take part in. And in fact, one of my main concerns about Richard Dawkins' approach is not that he's raised these questions. I think they're very good questions, but he doesn't seem to have the philosophical insight that actually this question is rather more complicated than he thinks it is. I mean, for example, in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, which came out in 2003, he is very, very rude about Karl Popper, who he calls a truth heckler. For me, Karl Popper is just someone who tried to say, can we be clear what we mean when we think a theory has explained something, what criteria we use? And that seems to me not to be heckling truth, but actually questing for truth. So I welcome the point you've made. The debate between us really is whether we call that natural theology or not, but it certainly needs to be done, and it's a very worthwhile thing indeed.
Could you suggest a term for that?
I suggest a term for it. I will think about that.
Okay, got time maybe for one more question if anyone has one. Yes, there's a question. Can you use the microphone? Yes.
I'd just like to ask if you could name a writer who writes about theological fabulosa. I was just rather intrigued by the idea of theology based on myth. It's not really relevant to the rest of this, but I'm just rather taken by that. Thanks.
Well, certainly I can. The question was, could I name a writer who talks about Theologia Fabulosa? Varro, V-A-R-R-O, of course, takes that very, very seriously. His view is this is for simple-minded people who like stories, whereas natural theology deals with reasons for more sophisticated people. But interestingly, even in Varro, you find this realization that there are different ways of thinking. And so he's basically almost saying that there are conceptual ways of thinking about this, and there are ways of thinking that are based on narratives. And actually, while he's a concept man, he's nevertheless aware that narratives have a very important role to play.
I thought this referred to a Christian writer who was basing theology or relating theology to this.
No, and the answer is that someone like Augustine, for example, interacts with Varro and will dismiss Theologia Fabulosa, except he's saying we have a Christian narrative, which of course tells a different story and makes some interesting points. He likes the idea of Theologia Naturalis and says that we need to have a good conversation about that. He also is very much aware of the importance of civil theology, because for him, the key question is, since Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the question of how it maintains its religious identity while fulfilling its social role without compromising each of them is actually very significant. So actually, in many ways, when you read Augustine commenting on Varro, it's about how Christianity took over, not simply the social functions, but also in many ways the status of the classical pagan system that used to predominate in Rome.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think we really want to thank Alister for a great overview on natural theology. So thanks very much.